so I'll forget. In any event, I wasn't at last night's. I can tell you the place buzzed about what she talked about last night. No matter what kind of coach, from where they were, either gender, it didn't matter. It just resonated with a lot of people. So as a health teacher, I can tell you I'm very anxious to listen to her message today. So hopefully we can, and from what she says, it'll be something we can use, practical stuff. And hopefully educating us a little bit more too on a topic that I think it never goes out of date. And the one thing I got to ask you, when I first started teaching health, we talked about something called eating disorders. And then the American Psychological Association came out and said, that's not the way we say it. It's disordered eating. So I remember telling my classes that. I said, folks, never think you have eating disorders. It's disordered eating. Doesn't that make you feel better? So I don't know, but that's something you can address if you've ever heard that.
Yeah,
so,
I haven't heard that exactly. But
yeah, okay, well, you got to read psychology today.
I will,
okay.
Yes, you got me interested.
All right, that's
great.
Rachel Steil.
Okay, I am going to make you guys talk together, so if you want to scoot in even more and sit next to someone, you get to know each other throughout this. It's going to be a little bit interactive, nothing outside the box, but we're going to keep it interesting. So I'm really grateful to be here. Like you said, I was here virtually. It's nice to actually be able to visit Minnesota. I'm also here in part sponsored by the Christine Wheeler Foundation, which helps to sponsor our nonprofit Running in Silence, which you'll learn more as we get started. So think of a big turning point in your life. Mine happened on this deck at my parents' house, and I stayed with my parents each summer between semesters at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I ran cross-country and track. And a lot of the times I spent writing because I was an English major. I was really into the reading and writing, and I wanted someday to write a book about running. And so one week, my parents were off on vacation. I was sitting with my little laptop in front of the windows overlooking this deck and this beautiful backyard. And I was reminiscing, sort of thinking about the previous few years I had been running in college. I had a breakout year my freshman year. I was running the fastest times I had ever run in my life. It was super exciting. But just a few years later, at this point in front of this deck, I was thinking about how the previous track season, I hadn't even competed. I told my coach that I needed to step aside. We talked back and forth about it for a while, trying to figure out if this was the right thing to do. And honestly, at this point in the summer, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to compete that following fall. I was in the midst of struggling with a full-blown eating disorder, going to a therapist and a dietitian, and I wasn't sure if I could even love running anymore, if it really meant enough to me. And that's saying a lot for someone who started running when they were 5 years old. I was so excited to do this in college, and suddenly just didn't know where to go from here. And so I was thinking about this, writing about it, and I noticed off in the distance between the trees that the bright blue sky started to turn into a dark gray-green. The wind was picking up, branches were falling all over this deck, and it started to rain. You could hear thunder in the distance. And I thought, okay, this is my sign to just stop writing and watch this cool thunderstorm. And then I thought, as it started to just downpour rain, how about I just go outside and step in the rain and let it wash away all my problems? I was kind of dramatic at the time. I was 21, just going like through this mid-20s crisis, it felt like. And so I was about to step out into the rain, and then I had another idea. I turned around and went to the bathroom to grab the one thing that had determined my self-worth and happiness for so many years. It was a little scale, nothing crazy, not very heavy, but it carried so much weight for me. This was the scale I had purchased right before college. It was the scale I stepped on every single day to look at a weight that I felt was going to tell me how well I would compete, how well my performances would be, and I thought this was the thing that helped me to be successful that first year in college. I had heard of other people smashing their scales and being able to move on from their eating disorders, so I thought that when the storm came through, that it was another cool sign for me to smash the scale and be able to move on with my life. And I thought, okay, well, if I can let go of this eating disorder, then maybe I can get back to my sport. And so I grabbed the scale, I go walk out onto the deck, and I'm immediately just drenched with water. I'm feeling invigorated. I'm thinking, okay, I'll write about this someday. I'll finally be able to have my comeback. I can drop this weight that I don't like, thinking I'll keep, just appease the eating disorder and be able to move forward. And so I'm getting all pumped up, and I raise the scale and smash it as hard as I can against that side railing of the deck. Well, I didn't think about how much it would hurt to try to smash plastic against wood, so immediately I was in a lot of pain. I was like clutching my fingers. I dropped the scale, waited for the pain to go away, and I thought, okay, well, I put a lot of effort into that. I must have broken the scale. Let's check it out. So I looked down, and there's one little dent and one little scratch. Did not break into a million pieces. Suddenly, the thunderstorm was just moving on through. Lightning and thunder in the distance are dissipating. The rain is letting up, and I'm just the soaking wet mess on the deck. I'm really glad my parents weren't home to just see this girl standing out there looking at this half-broken scale. And you could say, my eating disorder was going nowhere. It didn't just suddenly disappear. My mental health was still really stuck, and I couldn't even break this freaking scale. I'm not the only athlete who has struggled with an eating disorder and found themselves stuck like this. As the author of the book Running in Silence, I've heard from so many other athletes who don't know how to tell their coaches about what is going on, or they're not sure if they're really struggling with an eating disorder, they don't know how to move forward. And as a coach for the past 9 years, I've heard from other coaches who have had a specific struggle with an athlete, or they want to learn more about how to handle these issues. And honestly, when I started coaching, I wasn't sure what to do. I had struggled with an eating disorder, and I still didn't have a toolkit. I wasn't sure how to start recognizing it going forward, because I knew from my own story and hearing from others that this was really common. So what do you think when you think of eating disorders? Maybe you saw the title of this talk and you were like, oh, maybe this is the thing, I'll check this out, not really sure what this is, haven't thought about it before, would be interesting to learn. Or maybe you think it's important to weigh my athletes or check their body fat. Maybe it could be helpful if someone's losing too much weight. Honestly, when I was first struggling with an eating disorder, I was wondering why my coach wasn't weighing us. I was wondering why he wasn't tracking our food, because I thought that this was the secret to success. Or maybe you do know this is a problem. Maybe you're thinking of an athlete right now that you've been working with, but you don't really know how to handle it. No one is helping to guide you, or you don't know the next step to take to help this person because it's a very complex issue. But how common is this? Maybe you're thinking of one athlete, but what if there are more? According to the few studies that are out there, this one in particular, female distance athletes, about 1 in 5 of them will struggle with an eating disorder. And this is a 2007 study, so it was a while back, but there's not a lot out there. This is the best one we have so far. That would be like in a cross-country race, so maybe 100 runners. That would be 20 runners. That surprised me as well when I looked at this. Athletes in general are 2 to 3 times more likely to struggle with an eating disorder than the general population. That's not to say that sports are a bad thing. Obviously, they offer so many benefits, but this is a big problem that we aren't addressing. As far as I know, there are no specific or mandatory trainings on eating disorders in athletes, yet it's happening this much. For eating disorders in men, because it does happen in men as well, about 33% of men in weight class or aesthetic sports, which would include running, struggle with eating disorders as well. Again, this isn't just running, it goes across the board in all sports. So some men who have talked about their eating disorders include Mike Margema, who's a professional baseball player, Joey Julius, who's a Penn State football kicker, and Patrick DeVenny, who is also a football player. And I think most of us are track here today, so we'll stay in the track realm, but just so you're aware, this isn't just a long distance female runner issue. So where does that leave us? Well, mental health is starting to become a big buzzword now, which is really helpful. We're starting to make some strides going forward. But where does that leave us coaches? According to Dr. Paula Quattromoni, who is a leading eating disorders and sports expert in the US, athlete well-being is part of a coach's responsibility. Yes, we're focusing on training and technique and skills, but we also want to make sure that our athletes are in a healthy place overall as whole people. Okay, so some of this might feel a little taboo, it's stigmatized, you might feel uncomfortable, you're not sure how, it's a tricky topic, and I felt the same way as I was starting to coach. But you're here, which shows that you're serious about this, you care, and you want to start making a difference. So thank you for being here today, because this can be a really tricky topic. I just lost my place. Oh, the cards. I forgot to pass these out, and I don't have many left, but if you have pieces of paper that you could write on, if you have any questions throughout the talk that you want to ask me anonymously, and write down your email, because I know, like I said, this is a tricky topic. I can answer your questions individually, but I'll also leave these few on each side if you want to pass a few around. There's not a lot left. We missed out on some last night with people's questions. This is our social media and my email right here. I just want to put it up front and out there so that you guys know where to reach me. But if you can put your email into any questions you have throughout the talk, that would be great. And we'll try to answer questions at the end as well. Keep in mind, I am not a therapist or a dietitian. I am a coach like you. I'm an athlete who struggled, and there's a lot that we can start to do moving forward. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible because we have a lot on our plates. So we're sticking to the 3 R's today. Recognition of eating disorders, how to assist an athlete with receiving help, and your role in the recovery process. Once you have these 3 R's, you're much more likely to feel confident approaching your athletes, and anyone who might be struggling will feel like they're getting the help that they deserve and be able to get back to the sport they love. Because if we're not addressing this issue, they aren't able to compete to the best of their ability. So let's tackle that first R and see how aware you really are. These are 3 photos of me racing at Aquinas College. With a person next to you or nearest to you, talk about which photo you think I was struggling with an eating disorder the most. We'll say the one to the left is number 1, the middle one is number 2, the one all the way to the right is number 3. You can talk for a minute.
The other 2 look like.
But it could be one of the
Right.
There's not always good clue, I guess.
She might be losing too much weight. Only the African runners really look at how good is that one look. And, never know.
There you go.
That's a good, yeah.
Does anyone want to share what you were discussing in your little groups?
Well, I was thinking about the left one because it looks like doesn't have an awful lot of fat on her.
Mm-hmm.
And, just watching a lot of women runners, they usually have a little bit more than she has.
Okay, good. Anyone else brave enough to share? Thank you. Yes.
So, I happen to have a family member with an eating disorder, and I know when we notice her struggling the most, she would maybe appear a little more like the right one. She'd be having success, and then she would see photos of her own self, and at least there's not a tipping point where the disorder kind of took over. She wasn't able to kind of help herself. So to me, I'm drawn to that way.
Okay, good. Anyone else want to share?
We're kind of on the right.
On the right? Okay. Did anyone think the middle one?
I would see you arguing for which one.
Good. So maybe all of them? Could be a trick question.
Sure, trick question.
Okay, let's see if you're right. In this first photo, I had just completed my first year at Aquinas College. I was breaking school records, feeling really on top of the world with my running. But if you would have read my journal, you would have noticed that I had written that I couldn't stop thinking about food, but I had no idea how to stop. If you sat next to me in any of my classes, you probably would have noticed that I was writing down numbers on the side of my notes, barely even able to concentrate on what my professor was saying because I was so focused on the calories I had eaten for lunch and what I was allowing myself to eat the rest of the day. But I didn't think I had an eating disorder because I thought I was just being disciplined. I thought that I had to go hungry because everyone else could eat normally and I just had to restrict my food a bit. I was still eating 3 meals a day, most of it being largely vegetables because I was trying to reduce how many calories, but a lot of people looked at what I was eating and thought because I was eating 3 meals a day that it was enough. Maybe you have an athlete who looks similar to me in this middle photo. At the time, I had just returned from a long knee injury. It took a few months for it to heal when it should have just taken a few weeks, and that was partially because anytime it just felt a little bit better, I tried to start running again because I was so scared that if I wasn't running, I wouldn't be able to control my food, that everything would go out of control. And I began to restrict my food more often. I was starting to binge and feeling like my control of food was going out of control. I was constantly comparing myself to other competitors. I was comparing myself to where I had been just a year prior. And most of my teammates and my coach actually thought, if they were worried about that first photo, they actually thought I was healthier in this one and that everything was okay. In this photo, I was really mostly struggling with binge eating disorder, which is eating enormous quantities of food and feeling very out of control. And the best way for me to explain what this feels like is actually like having a mosquito bite, one that is very itchy that you're trying to avoid scratching because the more you scratch it, the itchier it is, it's just bothering you more and more, but you can't stop thinking about it because it just itches so bad. We have a lot of mosquitoes in Michigan, so.
Were you throwing up then after the binge eating?
What?
Were you throwing up after the binge eating?
I was not until later. Good question. So binge eating and purging are a little bit different. Usually binging doesn't have compensatory behaviors. I was struggling with this feeling of like needing to scratch that itch or give in to a specific food craving because I had limited foods for so long and now my body was trying to fight back for the calories. So for example, one night I was in the library trying to focus on a paper, couldn't stop thinking about it, just like that itch, I felt like I couldn't scratch, and I just broke. I ended up leaving the library about an hour after trying to concentrate and went to a little cafe on campus where they had energy bars. It was a brightly lit cafe, all my classmates were in there talking and laughing and eating, just a typical college night after studying, and I bought 5 energy bars and left. Now, most of us who have had maybe a late night snack would probably try to find a nice comfortable spot, sit on the couch in front of the TV, but I was so desperate for this food that I went to the first secluded place that I could find. And that ended up being the women's bathroom. So I went in there, I locked myself in a stall, sat on the toilet, and opened my backpack where I had the energy bars and started eating the first one. Instantly, the moment I bit into that, it was just like being able to scratch that itch. It was just euphoric. I finally felt that I could give into my cravings. I didn't like that I was doing this, but I felt powerless to it. I finished the first energy bar, I went on to the second one, I finished the third one, the fourth, and then the fifth. By that point, I was so physically stuffed that I was really uncomfortable, but I still needed to scratch the itch a little more. So I went right back to the cafe, acted like I hadn't just been in there, bought 5 more energy bars, and you can probably guess where I went to next. Right back to the same bathroom stall, locked myself in there so that I was secluded, no one could see me, and ate the 6th through 10th energy bars. By that point, I felt like my stomach was going to rip. I could barely stand up, I could barely sit back down, and I carefully walked out of the bathroom, again, trying to pretend that nothing was wrong. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I said that I was struggling with disordered eating. I didn't think that I could get help. I thought no other athlete is struggling with this in this way. Any athlete who is struggling with food just doesn't eat enough and I'm eating too much. What will this mean for my running? And I feel so alone. So when we look at these three pictures, and you think of maybe athletes on your team that you coach, if you knew what was happening behind their appearance, would you reach out to them? Now that you know what was happening a little more behind each photo here, I was struggling with an eating disorder the most in the third photo all the way to the right. Yes, I was struggling with an eating disorder. In each photo, it was a different phase, but I think it was even tougher with the one all the way to the right because I had gained weight and a lot of people around me assumed that, again, if they were worried about me in that first photo, I must be better by that final photo. But I was constantly berating myself, constantly going between restricting and binging and comparing myself. The key to this is win. Weight isn't necessary to determine if someone is struggling with an eating disorder. A lot of us often look for someone who has lost a bunch of weight, but someone may not lose any weight at all. They may not have the drastic fluctuations that I did. Yes, I was physically affected, but more so, the eating disorder affected me emotionally and socially. There were so many other factors in my life that affected my poor performances in relation to the eating disorder. So the sooner I was able to recognize that weight isn't necessary to determine that I had an eating disorder, the sooner I felt like I could actually get help and reach out to someone. The sooner I started to meet with a dietitian, although that was later down the road, and I could understand why I was binging so much from all the restriction of calories and food leading up to that point. And the sooner I felt like I could actually recognize that my struggle was valid. But there are so many other athletes like me who don't feel that their struggle is valid or worth speaking out about. So what do we do when it's this hard to recognize if we can't just look at someone? What do we do to be able to recognize eating disorders? Part of it is having conversations with our teams. This high school version of myself holding the little trophy in the middle would have loved to have more conversations surrounding mental health in high school. I had no idea that disordered eating affected athletes. I thought it was just someone who was skin and bones in the hospital on an IV drip. I didn't think that what I was struggling with was common and harmful for my running and for my sports going forward. I would have appreciated if we had this conversation with mental health, if we brought in even the counselor or had some talk about how it's valid for athletes to speak with a therapist if they're struggling, that we don't just have to be this hardcore person all the time pushing through everything, that it's okay to struggle, what disordered eating might look like for an athlete, and that it's okay to ask for help if you're struggling. One person that we have brought in to speak to our athletes is actually a registered sports dietitian, and she has been great in terms of starting this dialogue. We found her through eatright.org. That's probably the best spot to find a dietitian. You can find one in your area. And the biggest thing is you want to look for a registered sports dietitian. They might have the credentials CSSD. People have asked about what kind of fees dietitians usually charge. I have found anywhere from $200 to $800. I understand not every sports program is going to have the funding. One thing we have found is being able to put together fundraisers each year has helped with our cross-country account to try to bring in a registered dietitian. Then I started speaking with our athletic director about how we could bring this in for all athletes at our school and just really pushing for it. We as coaches are incredible advocates for our athletes. I get it, it can be really tough in our positions. I have been learning myself as I navigate this. I've had multiple conversations with our athletic director about how to get in more conversations like this, but I've seen nothing but benefits once we've been able to get a dietitian to come speak. At the very least, we've had our dietitian speak half an hour every year to our cross-country team, and it's been life-changing for them. It started conversations around Red S. Has anyone heard of Red S? A few hands? Okay, more, okay. So it's relative energy deficiency in sport, which is how restrictive food intake can affect all systems of the body and performances. So our dietitian will go into that. And puberty, menstrual cycle for girls. It just gets that conversation going, and it's really nice because then the girls feel like they can have this conversation. Dietitian should obviously speak to men as well. They're probably not going to have that menstruation conversation, but just a general conversation about RED-S, which does affect men as well, can be really important. Keep in mind too, when we're focused on recognizing eating disorders, you may miss some. You're not going to recognize and be able to diagnose every single person on your team that has an eating disorder, but you're starting a conversation and you know to look beyond just appearances. So one thing to also keep in mind is that athletes usually who are injured or going through puberty are usually more likely to struggle with disordered eating. So those are some of the people to start looking out for as well. When we recognize that eating disorders are more than just weight and that it's common, we're much more likely to spot these things. One phrase that we can use too is, are you concerned about eating or weight, body image? Basically, as coaches, we're here to listen and help you create good habits. So you don't have to get into drastic detail about all the signs and symptoms of eating disorders, just saying you're here to talk because we're here to create relationships with our athletes. How do we work on getting an athlete we think might be struggling to actually receive help? Think of something that may have been really personal to you and you tried to share it with someone and maybe their reaction wasn't what you were hoping for. My mom was exactly that person that I decided to share my eating disorder with, and it did not go as expected. Like I said, I'm a writer, so I thought, oh, I'll write an email and explain everything to her because I was too embarrassed to tell her about what was going on in person. And that's just a snippet of the email. That was back in 2012. This is when I was really struggling with binge eating. I didn't know how to control my food, and I was just at a loss. I didn't know what to do. So I reached out to her, explained what was going on, and she responded back with, okay, I hear you. Let's talk about this over dinner. So we went to a restaurant, of all places, to talk about this possible eating disorder. She ordered a big plate of lasagna. I had a large bowl of salad. Typical disordered eating at that time. I felt I couldn't eat anything else that I actually enjoyed. And she started the conversation with, wow, I never realized you had an eating disorder. I always thought you ate so much. Which just made me think, oh my gosh, maybe I'm making a bigger deal out of this. Like, this isn't a big problem. Why did I even tell her this? This is embarrassing. And then she said, well, how about you just eat less and exercise more? As if I hadn't already been doing that, and I just wanted to scream at her like, I understand that, but for some reason it's not working anymore. I feel like I can't control my body. And that just made me think, I just have no discipline and willpower anymore, and I don't know how to fix this. And when we got home, she suggested that I get on the scale. She said, let's just see how much you weigh and work from there. She's trying to be helpful, and I just burst into tears. I did not get on that scale. I knew exactly how much I weighed. I was not ignorant to any of this, and she was trying to offer advice. She thought this was a little thing that I'd get over in a few days, but it went much deeper than that, and she started to see that through the tears. Now, one thing I really wish I would have been able to explain to her that I just didn't know at that time is when athletes or anyone in general is restricting types of food or food intake, it's a lot like holding your breath. So most of us have probably gone underwater, held our breath, and when you come to the surface, you're going to take in large gulps of air because you're trying to catch up to all the breathing you missed out on. Well, that's very similar to someone with an eating disorder. If they've been restricting for a while, when they come to the surface, usually they're going to start eating large quantities of food. Well, I just thought, again, that was just lack of discipline and willpower. But if you were to tell someone who just came to the surface of the water after holding their breath for 2 minutes that they just need to have more discipline and willpower and breathe normally right away instead of taking large gulps of air, that's usually not going to work very well. So encouraging someone who's struggling actively in recovery to just eat normally usually isn't going to work. The body is really smart. And my mom encouraging me to just eat less and exercise more, just simple things, obviously wasn't helping. And so she realized this and came came back for conversation the next day and offered to get me professional help. Now that was a scary word for me. I didn't really think it was necessary to go that far, so I rejected it until 8 months later. I ended up going to an eating disorder therapist and eventually an eating disorder sports dietitian. The dietitian ended up being the game changer for me, but it took a long time for me to actually accept that because I was in so much denial with the eating disorder. So once I was open to receiving that kind of change, my mom and I ended up going back to that restaurant years later. We both would order lasagna and actually enjoy our time together. I learned how important it was to get her support, not advice. And ultimately, I'm so glad that I told her, even though that first conversation wasn't perfect, it wasn't great, it did start that process of getting the help that I needed. I explain this a lot more in the Running in Silence book as well. That conversation with my mom and all of the relationships that the eating disorder affected, I think is showcased really well. It's not just about all the weight I lost and gained, but it's about how it affected everything else, including my performances. That brings me to the triple S model that I put together. The first one, say something. So if you notice an athlete is maybe just seems a little off, they aren't acting as they normally would, don't ignore the signs. You want to say something. It's not that you're diagnosing them with an eating disorder, but it's worth approaching the topic. Second, we're here as coaches to support our athletes, not offer advice. You can probably recall my mom's conversation with me. You don't want to say those kind of things, you're there to support, and we'll talk more about what that support looks like. And then maybe that athlete has brought up the eating disorder to someone. Maybe if I would have told my mom and had that poor reaction and she didn't actually help me, I might have eventually reached out to my coach. And that second person that they reach out to could very well be you. And if you're there with open arms, offering support, that could be a huge shift in whether or not they're open to receiving help. Just highlighting how important our roles are. Let's say you notice some signs, behaviors are off with one of your athletes, and you want to start to approach them, have this conversation about whether or not they might be struggling. So first thing you want to do is actually talk to your athletic trainer. Does everyone here have athletic trainers? Anyone not? Okay, if you didn't, you could also talk to the school health person or counselor and have a conversation about what you've been noticing. You can work as a team, they're like your teammate, and prepare for this conversation with an athlete. And because we develop such strong relationships with our athletes, we're actually one of the best people to have these conversations. So this is put in a full blog post with Dr. Paula Quattromoni, who is on our advisory board. I had a lot to learn from her, and one of the biggest questions we had from coaches was, how do you approach an athlete who might be struggling? So she goes into much more detail. You can find that on the runninginsilence.org website, or if you'd like me to sign you up for the newsletter, you can write down your email and then write down newsletter and hand it to me at the end of this too. The first newsletter that goes out has this direct link as well as other specific questions that coaches have asked. But this is the biggest one. And so she goes into much more detail, but I'm keeping it as simple as possible. First, when you're having this conversation with an athlete, you're checking in. So when I ask you all, how are you doing? How do you normally respond? Good, yeah. And typically your athletes are going to respond that way as well. So another way you can get that conversation going a little more is on a scale of 1 to 10, how have you been feeling this week in workouts or at school? Or name 3 specific emotions that you've been feeling today or yesterday. Maybe they're not going to respond in full detail, but like I said, it gets the conversation going. And then you lead into 2 to 3 specific behaviors that you've noticed. Not what anyone else has told you, but what you as a coach have noticed. So does that include weight changes? We don't want to comment on weight changes. So I had a coach at one point say that he noticed that I lost a bunch of weight and asked if I was eating enough. Well, in my eating disorder mindset, I took that as a compliment and shut down. We didn't have any more of a conversation after that. if an athlete has been gaining weight, I think it's pretty obvious to most of us we don't want to comment on that either. So you're talking about behaviors like, I've noticed you haven't been coming to the pasta dinners or dinners with your teammates lately, or you seem really sluggish in workouts, is everything okay? Basically sharing your concern and these few behaviors that you've noticed. They might be in denial, they might just kind of shut it down. You're going to move the conversation forward and say, these things really concern me. I think it's worth getting checked out by our athletic trainer. Are you willing to get that help? Again, they may still be in denial, so you can say something along the lines of, okay, I hope you're correct, I hope this isn't what is going on, but the only way for us to really know is to be evaluated by a healthcare professional. Not every conversation is going to go perfectly. In an ideal world, it would, and they would just be out about whatever they're struggling with, whether it's an eating disorder or depression or anxiety, but it's not going to happen in that first conversation. At least you're planting a seed, and some athletes are just waiting for someone to say something. Going back to that first S. Like I said, we have more Q&As similar to this one on our website, runninginsilence.org. They've been really helpful. Paula Quattromoni is the best. She is the ultimate expert in this area. These are the kind of resources that we can start to use to assist our athletes with receiving help. So with the people next to you in your little groups again, discuss which of these you know you have available to you or which ones you wish you had. More than 3? No. What 3 do you have, if you're willing to share?
We have a registered sports dietitian, does not work for the school, but, she's coming to speak with our athletes.
Great.
and Provide us handouts and offer, we haven't paid anything, offer to be a resource for us for the year. So we feel very fortunate there. We have a mental health counselor and
Great. Yeah, so most people are probably going to have about 2, like the athletic trainer, mental health counselor. Athlete fueling stations, that's probably going to happen more at like the college level, but at least for our cross-country team, we usually have leftover food from cross-country track meets, and we use that before practices. We'll bring it out and have athletes snack on that. We have chocolate milk right after workouts with our strength trainer, coach. You guys are
I
nodding.
did have a question about what that
Yeah.
is. So it's really a variety of good refueling foods.
Having food
and
available
drinks.
to athletes, yeah. They're more, I guess, a professional term in the college scene, athlete fueling stations. One thing with ongoing nutrition education, that would be like having a dietitian come speak to all the sports teams. We're trying to get it to happen 3 times a year. It's pushing it a little, but we're trying. The biggest thing with this list is just remembering that I'm going to say this over and over, you're a great advocate for your athletes. If there's any one of these that you don't have but you think you could start to get implemented into your program, please consider speaking with your athletic director. I have found only good conversations coming from that. Sometimes it takes a while, it takes a few years, but we're helping our athletes with this kind of education and with these kind of resources. Okay, recovery. What is our role in the recovery process? Think of a mistake you may have made over and over, thinking that at one point it'll eventually go a different way and you'll feel successful. With me for recovery, I was thinking that if I just restricted a certain food or restricted in a certain way, just made it a little bit different, that it would develop into a good thing over time. I could just keep a piece of the eating disorder and move forward with my running. I was continually going to a therapist and dietitian who were very helpful, but I was still stuck in wanting that piece of the eating disorder. So I had to start asking myself a few questions. First, why do you want to lose weight? Well, because I think it helps me to run faster. Why is it so important that you run fast? Well, most of us want to be successful in our sports. We want our athletes to meet, all of their goals. But for me, my sport meant everything. It was my entire identity. If I didn't perform well, if I didn't have my sport anymore, everything crumbled. And that's when I started to notice this was a really big problem, because when I lost running for a bit with my injury, when I lost some of my control over food, I just felt like I couldn't move forward in my life with anything. I just felt like a shell of a person. And you probably have athletes who have found themselves in similar ruts or just feel very stuck, whether it's with disordered eating or just with their obsession in one sport. It could be over-exercising as well. And it's hard to know how to support them through that. So when we look at the differences between a therapist, a dietitian, and a coach, it's important to notice how distinct and different those areas are. One of the coaching, trainings that we have in Michigan that I went to, the person in charge of it was trying to pump us up, and they were like, okay, you as coaches, you're athletic trainers, you're psychologists, you're therapists, just trying to say, we kind of take on a bunch of roles, but we want to keep in mind that we don't want to go out of our area of expertise. So when we think of a therapist, a dietitian, and an athletic coach, I often think, okay, a therapist is focusing on the mind, a dietitian is focusing on specific meal plans or food, and a coach is focusing more on the spirit, training, skills, and technique. And we want to make sure that those things are very distinct. That should be a huge relief to us. That means we want to avoid any weighing of our athletes, because that should be left to the medical professionals. If we're in charge of weighing our athletes, even if we think it's a good thing, like we're making sure they don't lose too much weight, we could actually be delaying their professional help, getting them the professional help that we need. We want to avoid any food shaming or body shaming. Dietitians can work in any areas individually with an athlete to determine what foods are best for them, what their ideal body weight would be, but that should be left to the dietitian. That follows along with restrictive eating or dieting. We don't want to encourage any athletes to restrict certain foods. They could be missing specific nutrients they need. And as most of us know, athletes are really, like when we tell them one thing, they might go all the way with it. We want to avoid encouraging any dieting. Obviously that didn't go well for me because when I started restricting my food intake, obviously I got more injured, I wasn't able to compete, so we're actually helping our athletes by being able to avoid these kind of things. According to this study, athletes are actually very helpful when they're involved in the prevention and treatment of eating disorders. So it's not to say that we're completely hands-off from the situation. We're there to support and check in with our athletes. As you'll see in a moment, my coach was a great example of this. Another thing that we can do in terms of food is really encouraging fueling throughout the day. So checking in with our athletes, making sure they had breakfast, lunch, maybe a snack after school, and dinner, maybe reiterating some of the things that we heard the dietitian say to the athletes. You're just encouraging them to follow what the professionals have said. You could use the basic plan like the US dietary guidelines. And one thing that I have found very helpful is to make sure that athletes know how important it is to refuel on off days or recovery days. A lot of high schoolers especially seem to think that if they're not exercising, they shouldn't be eating as much. And telling them, you know, you're probably going to be hungrier than usual. You do need to honor your hunger. You need to refuel within 30 minutes of a workout. Saying those things over and over has been very helpful, at least from what I've seen, and it's something that we can do as coaches. My college coach was a great example of someone who was very supportive. He didn't know everything there was to know about eating disorders, but he seemed to know how to handle me when I told him about what was going on. Now, a little bit about my coach. He is kind of a nerd at heart. He just loves running, loves being competitive. He wanted us to be at the top of the podium in the NAIA, and so he and I just love to be competitive. But he also has a big heart. He will just randomly blurt out things at some of our races. We had one of the girls go by during the conference meet and he said, "The table is set, now all you have to do is eat dinner." Or he told one girl when she ran by, he's like, "This is magical." So he would just say things like that. He would just get so excited, jumping around and clapping everywhere. So excited, into running, and this was the person I was telling about my eating disorder. And so you can probably guess, I told him through an email what was going on, and yes, I'm getting help, just thought you should know. And of course, he wanted a meeting, so we got together, talked, and one thing I really appreciate about him is that he is vulnerable as well. I mean, at the end of this conversation, we were both in tears, and I really appreciated that because it allowed me to feel that I could really explain my biggest fear. I said, "I'm so scared that I won't run as fast this year if I don't lose the weight." And he said, "You don't have to be fast, you have to be healthy." I didn't like hearing that, honestly. At first I was like, oh, he doesn't get it, like I want to be competitive, I want to run fast, like he doesn't understand the numbers. But he was looking for my long-term health, and he knew, I think, that focusing on my health was actually going to help me to run faster in the long run. I didn't immediately have the comeback I wanted. I was not as fast as I wanted to be, but I was able to continue competing. I was part of the 7th place national finishing team. I wouldn't have been able to continue competing if my coach had encouraged me to, yes, restrict my food a little more again. Yes, keep going down this path, or I don't know, find someone that's going to help you to lose weight. A part of me felt a little bit of relief when I had this conversation with my coach, because I no longer had someone else putting this weight of expectation on me to continue to lose weight. And I'm really grateful that he stuck to 3 things he was really good at. Skills and technique, so we worked on my form. We didn't focus on weight at all. He talked to me about how strong I was. He was constantly checking in with me. Every few weeks, he would lightly bring up the conversation about the disordered eating, just check in, make sure I'm doing okay. I appreciated that because I didn't want to bring it up, but I'm glad he did. And he focused on my leadership and character. Again, I was able to continue competing for him and be much healthier down the road because of his focus on my health. One last thing before I wrap up with the final story for today. I mentioned Running in Silence as a 501c3 nonprofit. What we do is speak around the country to coaches like you, as well as athletes, so that they feel empowered to speak up as well. This basically came about from the book, where's the book? Right there. The book Running in Silence, which was published in 2016. Once I started hearing more stories from athletes and digging into the problem, I realized this wasn't being addressed. There weren't really any trainings out there. So if you have questions right now too about, we're finishing up in 3 minutes. Let me finish, and then if you have questions on a piece of paper that you want to hand to me at the end, I'll also be here to answer questions as well, because we'll have like half an hour between sessions. Okay, so you're probably wondering what happened to this scale. I tried to break the beginning of this. Well, the rain had passed, the thunderstorm had gone off into the distance, and it was now a nice bright blue summer day, and I decided to go out for a run just to clear my head, stop thinking about this weird feeling I had with a scale that was half broken, just kind of laying on that deck. And when I returned, I had one final good idea of the day. I went to the shed and grabbed a hammer. I brought the hammer over to the scale, and with one little tap of the hammer on the screen at the top, it broke. It didn't require a crazy smashing into a million pieces in the middle of a thunderstorm swirling around me and feeling victorious with this eating disorder just suddenly going away. All it took was using the right tools, having the support of my coach, having a therapist and dietitian, having the professionals, and recognizing that eating disorders weren't just about weight, that it was valid and I was worthy of getting help. We have a long road ahead of us as coaches because, like I said, as advocates and with very few resources that we have, we're trying to bring those resources together to start making a change going forward. Thank you again for being here, because what you guys do is really important, and this is a big issue that finally I'm hoping is working to be addressed. You're likely going to have an athlete who struggles with an eating disorder. How are you going to be a part of breaking that cycle today? Again, that's my information on the nonprofit. My email is up there. The website is runninginsilence.org. If you have questions, you can come talk to me or bring up a slip of paper with your question and email, and the newsletter you can find on the website to find all those Q&As. So, thank you.